The conjugation was wrong, not dangerously wrong, not the sort of error that would humiliate a boy in his examinations, but wrong enough that Cecilia Marsh felt it as a small interruption in otherwise well-ordered work, like a single stair set at the wrong height in an otherwise sound staircase. She corrected it without lifting her voice, without any alteration in her expression, because 8-year-old Thomas Ashworth had been trying very hard all morning and deserved precision rather than ceremony. Amabo, she said quietly, setting her finger below the word. The future tense carries the full weight of intention. I will love, not I am loving, not I loved, I will. There is a promise in the Latin future that English does not quite manage. Thomas looked at the page with the serious frown of a child who suspects he has been offered something important and is not yet sure where to put it. His sister Clara, 6 years old and already competitive, leaned across the table to study the word herself, as though proximity to it might transfer its meaning directly into her understanding. Through the schoolroom door, solid oak, set slightly ajar against the June warmth, Everard Ashworth, Duke of Kestmore, stood completely still. He had come to speak to the governess about Thomas's autumn examinations. He had the matter organized in his mind as he'd climbed the stairs. 3 points, each stated plainly, and a question about whether additional mathematics instruction would be required. He had composed it as he might compose a letter, knowing that a structured approach would make the interview brief and efficient for both of them. He had not expected Latin. He had not expected the future tense treated as a moral instrument. He had not, in point of fact, expected to stop walking at all. Again, said the governess, and Thomas said the word again, and this time he said it correctly, and there was a small sound from the girl, half admiration, half competitive frustration, and the governess said, with the same measured warmth, Clara, your turn will come, everything in its proper sequence. Everard's hand rested against the doorframe. He was not certain how it had come to be there. He had hired Miss Cecilia Marsh 6 weeks ago, on the recommendation of a solicitor who had handled the estate's affairs for 11 years, and who did not, as a matter of professional practice, recommend anyone lightly. The reference had been organized, precise, and detailed in a way that most employment references were not. Everard had read it twice. He had formed a picture in his mind, a competent woman of middle age, experienced and methodical. He had not been wrong about the competence or the method. He had been wrong about almost everything else. He was 34 years old. He had not forgotten what he came to say in a very long time. He listened for another moment, just another moment, and then he lowered his hand from the doorframe and walked back down the stairs. The 3 organized points remained in his mind, patient and unused. He would send a note. That was the appropriate course. But his footsteps slowed before he reached the bottom landing, and he stood there in the particular stillness of a man who has just noticed, with some precision, that something has shifted in the ordinary operation of his days, and does not yet know what to do with the information. Cecilia Marsh had been managing things that were not hers to manage for 9 years. The accounting started in 1838, when her father died of a fever caught on the road between Nottingham and Derby, leaving behind £400 of debt, a leased house in York that could not be kept, a younger sister of 15, and no male relative willing to be inconvenienced by any of it. Cecilia had been 22. She had sat with the figures for 2 evenings, because the figures deserved her full attention before she decided what to do with them. On the 3rd morning she rose, dressed, and went to speak with her father's creditor. He had not expected her. That had, as it turned out, been useful. She did not ask for clemency. She asked for 12 months, the specific terms of which she laid on his desk in her own hand. A graduated repayment schedule, drawn against the projected income she intended to generate as a hired educator. She had already made 3 inquiries. She had 2 provisional letters of interest. The creditor, a wool merchant who had dealt with her father in the ordinary way of commerce, and had not anticipated finding himself in negotiation with his dead client's daughter, read her terms twice, and agreed to 11 of the 12 months. She took 11 and began. She had learned not to count on things that merely looked like rescue. For 3 years she managed the debt, her sister Margaret's education, and her own placement, moving between households as Latin tutor, governess, occasional music instructor, with the particular efficiency of a person who cannot afford to waste an hour. She kept a ledger, not her employer's ledger but her own. Every engagement, every payment received, every expense itemized to the halfpenny. She knew at any point in those 3 years exactly where she stood, because the alternative was not knowing, and not knowing was a luxury she could not afford. By 1841 the debt was discharged. Margaret had a post of her own, in a schoolroom in Leeds. Cecilia had a reference, then 2 references, then a small reputation in certain professional circles for the particular thoroughness with which she prepared boys for their public school examinations. A solicitor named Mr. Aldous Prentice, who handled several estate accounts and had twice observed her work at a household where she was engaged, added her name to a short list he kept for educational appointments of consequence. He was 63, methodical, and not given to enthusiasm. He told her once, with the careful brevity of a man who was precise about the weight he assigned words, that she was the most organized mind he had encountered in 30 years of practice, which he recognized did not read as a compliment but was intended as one. She had taken it as one. She had been seen, now and then, over the 9 years. A father who had noticed her capacity before the fever took him, a headmistress at a school in Harrogate, who had offered her a permanent position that she had briefly considered, before concluding that permanent positions had a tendency to become invisible ones. Mr. Prentice. These moments of recognition had not softened her or made her expect more. They had simply confirmed what she had chosen to believe from the morning she sat down with the wool merchant's figures. That her work was real, that it had weight, that it was worth doing carefully. She was not going to step aside for anyone. She arrived at Kestmore Park in May of 1847, with 2 trunks, a letter of appointment, and a clear map of what she intended to accomplish. Thomas Ashworth was behind in Latin and reading. Clara Ashworth had had 3 previous governesses in 2 years, the departures of each politely documented and never fully explained. The estate itself, she had gathered this from the solicitor's careful phrasing, from what was not said rather than what was, had been running on reduced staff and complicated feeling since the death of the Duchess 4 years prior. She had managed complicated feeling before. She unpacked her trunks and went to meet the children. Thomas, she understood in the first hour, was not deficient. He was frightened of being wrong in front of someone who might judge him for it. Clara was not difficult. She was precise, demanding, and had been managed rather than taught by her previous governesses, and had developed contempt for the difference. By the end of the first week, Cecilia had reframed both problems. By the end of the 3rd week, Thomas was reading ahead of his age, and Clara was beginning Latin 2 years earlier than the standard curriculum recommended, which she had concluded was the right course, because the child's facility was evident, and letting it idle was a waste that could not be justified. She had also discovered, without particularly trying, that the Kestmore estate accounts had not been properly reconciled for 14 months. This was not her department. She was a governess. She kept her observation to herself for 2 weeks, during which she confirmed it through incidental evidence, an invoice she saw on the morning room table, a conversation between the housekeeper and a footman she was not meant to overhear, the particular quality of unease that ran through a household where the numbers were wrong, and everyone sensed it but no one was saying so plainly. She mentioned it to no one. She returned to her schoolroom, and her children, and her correctly conjugated verbs. She had been managing things that were not hers to manage for 9 years. She knew the difference between involvement and interference. Everard Ashworth had been brought home to Kestmore Park by his father's death in 1843, after which he had become the Duke of Kestmore, inherited 11,000 acres, a wool processing enterprise that had not modernized in 20 years, 4 tenant farms in various states of repair, and a household that was still, 4 years later, rearranged around the shape of grief. He understood this about his household. He was not without self-knowledge. His mother had died when he was 12. His father had lived 22 more years in a version of the estate that preserved everything the Duchess had touched: the rose garden, the morning room arrangement, the small upright pianoforte in the eastern sitting room that had not been tuned since 1831, with the particular stubbornness of a man who equated change with further loss. Everard had watched this from a school at 17, from a post abroad at 20, from a diplomatic appointment in Vienna at 26, and had understood it without being able to alter it. When he inherited, he had found the same arrangement in place. He had altered what was operationally necessary and left the rest where it was. The pianoforte had not been tuned. He noticed this every time he passed the eastern sitting room door. He had engaged Miss Marsh because the children needed consistency, and Prentice had used the word thorough 3 times in a paragraph that was not given to repetition. He had interviewed her in this room for 20 minutes. She had answered his questions with the direct economy of someone who had prepared what she needed to say, and saw no reason to surround it with anything additional. He had found this, unexpectedly, restful. He had offered her the position at the conclusion of the interview without requiring a second meeting. It was not until the 3rd week of her appointment that he understood precisely what he had hired. His estate manager, a man named Burkett who had served his father and was honest but slow, came to him with a question about a tenant farm account that did not reconcile across 2 quarterly periods. Burkett was troubled by it. He had been troubled by it for some time, apparently, but had not raised it, which was its own problem. Everard spent an afternoon with the ledger and found the error, a misallocation that had propagated across 5 subsequent entries, amounting to a discrepancy of £67 across 14 months, and corrected it. He mentioned this correction the following morning at breakfast, in no particular mood to discuss it further. "The Eastern Farm account," said Cecilia Marsh's voice from the doorway. He turned. She was standing at the threshold of the breakfast room. She had been passing, not entering, on her way to some other part of the house, with a neutrally attentive expression. "I beg your pardon?" he said. "The discrepancy in the Eastern Farm account," she said. "The misallocation began in March of last year. I believe it propagated forward from a single entry." She paused. "I noticed the invoice on the morning room table 3 weeks ago. I should have mentioned it sooner. I apologize for not doing so." He looked at her for a moment. "You are the governess," he said. "Yes," she said, with the same even tone. "I am. I noticed it anyway. Good morning, Your Grace." She continued down the hall. He stood beside the breakfast table for rather longer than was necessary. She had learned the shape of his household in 6 weeks, with the same methodical attention she applied to everything else. The housekeeper, Mrs. Lowry, brisk, Northumbrian, with an approach to sentiment that suggested she considered it a foreign country, had been the first person in the house to offer Cecilia anything approaching warmth, and she had done it by the simple expedient of telling her on the 2nd day that the 2 previous governesses had needed managing and that she did not anticipate Cecilia would require the same. This was Mrs. Lowry's version of welcome, and Cecilia had taken it as such. Mr. Prentice came twice in those first weeks, once to finalize a matter of estate administration, once on what seemed to be a pretext that required very little of either of them, and on both occasions he contrived to be in the schoolroom for some portion of the morning lesson, watching with his particular expression of careful satisfaction. He did not explain himself, and she did not ask. Lady Helena Vane arrived in the 3rd week. Lady Helena was 26, the daughter of a viscount, recently widowed without children, and she possessed the specific gravity of a woman who understood her own position in every room she entered. She was beautiful in the precise, credentialed way that made her beauty seem like a document confirming what was already known. She was also intelligent, which Cecilia did not underestimate and did not discount. She arrived with a maid, 3 trunks, and an invitation that had apparently predated Cecilia's appointment by some months. She was a cousin of some remove. She was the sort of connection that a household in want of management, social, relational, structural, might welcome with considerable relief. The household did not precisely welcome her with relief. Mrs. Lowry's expression, when Lady Helena's carriage appeared on the drive, was the expression of a woman completing a calculation she had already completed some time ago and did not enjoy. Cecilia watched from the schoolroom window, where she was reviewing Thomas's reading marks, and returned to her page. She had been in the household 8 days when Lady Helena came to the schoolroom. The visit was offered as interest. She wished to see how the children were getting on, she said, with the particular smile of a woman who is accustomed to her interest being received as a gift. She stood in the doorway and looked at the room, and at Cecilia, with the measuring quality of someone assessing a disruption to a picture she had already composed in her mind. "Miss Marsh," she said, "I understand you come very highly recommended." "I have good references," Cecilia said. "Thomas, continue to the end of the paragraph." Thomas continued. Clara watched Lady Helena with the direct, unsentimental gaze of a 6-year-old who had met several of her kind before. "The children look well," Lady Helena said. "They are," Cecilia said. "Excuse me." She moved to correct Thomas's pronunciation of a proper noun, without raising her voice, without hurrying, without offering Lady Helena any additional surface to work against. Lady Helena stood in the doorway another moment, then withdrew. Cecilia had managed disruption in household after household for 9 years. She knew exactly what Lady Helena's visit had been. She picked up her list and continued. But she also, later, alone in her room with her own ledger open on the table, sat for a moment, with her pen not quite touching the page. There was something in the way Lady Helena had looked at the schoolroom, at its order, at its specific placement in the household's geography, that suggested she understood rooms and their inhabitants as a kind of map. Cecilia was not on any map that Lady Helena had drawn. She was not certain whether that was a position of safety or invisibility. In her experience, the two had a tendency to become the same thing before you noticed. She pressed one hand briefly against the table, then completed her entry and closed the ledger. Everard sent the note about Thomas's examinations. He wrote it in the morning, had it delivered by midday, and received a reply by 3 in the afternoon that was so precisely organized that it answered all 3 of his points and added 2 considerations he had not thought to raise, each supported by a specific detail from Thomas's current work. The note was 2 pages. It contained no pleasantries beyond the opening salutation and closing signature. It contained more useful information about his son's educational progress than he had received in all the previous months combined. He read it twice, then a third time. He went to find Prentice, who was in the study reviewing a tenancy matter. "The governess," Everard said. He was not certain what he meant to say after that, but Prentice looked up with an expression of mild readiness, as though he had been anticipating this particular sentence for some time. "Miss Marsh," Prentice said. "Her previous placements," Everard said. "How long was she in each household?" Prentice was quiet for a moment, in the way of a man marshalling what he knows before he says it. "The longest placement was 14 months, in a household in Harrogate. The family relocated to Edinburgh. Her previous engagement before yours was 11 months. She departed when the children were sent to school. She has never been dismissed, Your Grace. She has left when there was no longer a reason to remain." Everard considered this. "And the 2 previous governesses to Thomas and Clara?" "Left," Prentice said carefully, "because the household was difficult." "Meaning the children." "Meaning," Prentice said, "the household." Everard understood. He returned to the study window and stood there for a moment. The east garden was visible. The June rose bed was in full flower, which it had not been when he was a boy, when his mother was alive and the garden was kept differently. Someone had, in the course of the estate's management, continued the roses without anyone organizing a decision to do so. He had not investigated this. He suspected Mrs. Lowry, who organized many things without organizing a decision. "Prentice," he said, "is there anything about Miss Marsh's situation that requires attention?" Prentice was quiet for longer this time. "Her salary is appropriate," he said. "Her rooms are adequate. She has asked for nothing." Another pause. "She mentioned to me, last week, that the schoolroom's northern window requires resealing before winter. She was not asking me to arrange it. She was noting it in case I had knowledge of the estate's maintenance schedule and could advise her on the timing." Everard looked at him. "I found this notable," Prentice said, with the particular neutrality of a man who considered the sentence sufficient. 3 days later, Everard walked past the eastern sitting room and heard, through the closed door, the sound of someone playing the pianoforte. He stopped. The instrument had not been touched in years. He had walked past this door on hundreds of occasions, and it had been silent every time. He stood now with his hand not quite touching the handle, and listened. It was not performed playing. It was not someone demonstrating their skill or their feeling. It was the sound of someone working through something privately, a short passage, returned to, corrected, returned to again, careful, exact, as though the person at the keys was measuring something. He stood in the corridor for a long time. When the music stopped, she stopped it cleanly, not with any diminishing of feeling, but with the particular decisiveness of a person who has finished the portion of work she intended to do. He lowered his hand and walked on. He returned to the corridor that evening and stood outside the same door. The room was silent. He did not know why he had come. He came again the following evening, and this time the music was there, a different passage, something he did not immediately recognize. He stood with one hand against the doorframe, his coat already removed for the evening, his cravat slightly disordered from a late meeting with Burkett about the tenant farm repairs, and he listened until she stopped. On the fourth evening, he did not wait for the music. He knocked. There was a brief pause on the other side of the door, the sound of a bench moving slightly, and then her voice, level and unhurried, "Come in." He opened the door. She was seated at the pianoforte bench, turned partially toward him, with the particular stillness of someone who has organized their expression into calm, rather than having calm naturally arrive. She was in the plain gray dress she wore for ordinary household hours, without the additional care of evening presentation. She looked, he thought, exactly like herself, in a way that was somehow different from how people usually looked in rooms. "Your Grace," she said. "I heard you," he said, 3 evenings ago, and again last night." She waited. "What is the second piece?" he said. "The one you played last night." A small pause. "It was in the music folio above the bench," she said. "I found it when I came to see if the instrument needed tuning." She paused again. "It did need tuning. I arranged for it to be done last week. I hope that was not an imposition." Mrs. Lowry gave permission. He crossed to the bench and looked at the music folio she indicated. He opened it. The piece was there, handwritten, not printed. Someone's private notation, the ink old and the hand very fine. He knew the hand. "This was my mother's," he said. Cecilia Marsh did not immediately speak. When she did, she said simply, "I didn't know. I can return it to the folio and not touch it again." "No," he said. He was aware, as he said it, that it was a decision rather than a response. He set the folio down carefully. She played it. "I remember, when I was young." He stopped. He had not said that sentence aloud in some years, and it landed in the room differently than he had expected. "I did not know she had written it down." Cecilia said nothing. She understood, he thought, that nothing was what the moment required. He stood for another moment, then said, "Your cravat observation would be more applicable if you addressed it to me directly." She looked at him, a single precise glance, and said, "Your cravat has been set at an angle since you came in. Slightly to the left. I assumed it was not intentional." "It was not," he said. She stood from the bench, crossed to him without particular ceremony, and straightened it with 2 small adjustments and then stepped back. Her hands, he noticed, were completely steady. She had been straightening difficult things for years. She had brought all of that practice directly to bear on his cravat. "Thank you," he said. "You're welcome," she said. He left the room and stood in the corridor for a moment, with his hand against the wall, collecting himself with the quiet discipline of a man who has had a great deal of practice at not being undone. He was not entirely successful. The estate's summer council met in the 3rd week of June. Everard had called it principally on account of the tenant farm repairs and a question about the Wool Enterprises northern contracts, which had not been renewed on terms he considered reasonable. The investors who held interest in the wool processing were 2, a gentleman named Sir Aldous Crane, who was 60 and considered himself the authority on all commercial matters touching the estate, and a younger man named Mr. Frederick Ashton, who deferred to Crane publicly and conducted his own calculations privately. Both arrived on the same day. Lady Helena, who had made herself essential to the household's social arrangements, with a speed that Cecilia recognized as genuine organizational skill, presided over the dinner that preceded the council meeting with accomplished ease. She was positioned, visibly, as the woman of the house, arranging the table, directing the footmen, attending to the conversation with the particular attentiveness of someone who understood that dinner was itself a negotiation. Cecilia dined in the schoolroom with the children, as was entirely correct and appropriate for her position. Thomas said, as she cut his bread. Lady Helena says she is going to make our house cheerful again. That is a kind intention, Cecilia said. Will it work? Clara said. Pass me your reading list, Cecilia said. We can discuss it after. The council began at 9 the following morning, in the East drawing room. Cecilia knew of it only in the general way of a household that cannot entirely contain its own business. Mrs. Lowry had told her, without being asked, that the meeting was expected to last most of the day, and had mentioned Sir Crane by name with an inflection that communicated a considered opinion she was not prepared to make explicit. By 10 in the morning, Cecilia could hear the voices from the schoolroom directly above, not the words, but the shape of the conversation. Sir Crane's voice was the one that carried. At 11, Prentice appeared at the schoolroom door. He was carrying a leather folder. His expression was the expression of a man who has been precise about the weight of his words for 30 years and is currently choosing them with particular care. Miss Marsh, he said, I wonder if I might speak with you for a moment. Thomas and Clara looked up from their work. Continue, Cecilia told them, and stepped into the corridor, pulling the door nearly closed behind her. There is a question, Prentice said, regarding the Eastern Farm account. She waited. The current quarterly figures do not reconcile with the projections Sir Crane brought with him, Prentice said. His projections are based on figures from the period of the misallocation. He has made some arguments based on those figures. A pause. Arguments that are, on their face, persuasive. But incorrect, Cecilia said. But incorrect, Prentice agreed. The difficulty is that the documentation of the correction exists in the ledger, but the ledger is not present in the council room. It is in Burkett's office, which is currently locked, and Burkett is in Nottingham with his brother until Thursday. Cecilia was quiet for a moment. What is Sir Crane arguing for, specifically? A renegotiation of the Northern wool contracts, Prentice said, on terms less favorable to the estate. He is also suggesting that the Eastern farm should be let, rather than maintained as tenant-farmed land, on the basis that it has shown a consistent deficit for 14 months. It has not shown a consistent deficit, Cecilia said. It showed a misallocated entry. The deficit is an artifact of the error. Yes, Prentice said. I know where the documentation is, she said. I can retrieve it. Prentice looked at her steadily. It is not your position to enter the council. No, she said. She thought for one moment, the complete, organized thought of a woman who was accustomed to making decisions with incomplete authority, and had learned to be precise about the boundaries. But you could present it, if I prepared it correctly. He looked at her with the expression she recognized from his previous visits. The particular quality of attention of a man watching something confirm itself. How long would you need? 20 minutes, she said. She knew the Eastern Farm account, not because she had studied it, but because her mind retained figures, the way other minds retained conversations. She had seen the invoice on the morning room table. She had followed the logic of the misallocation when Everard had mentioned it at breakfast. She had confirmed the trajectory of the error in her own mind, without anyone asking her to, and without any intention of acting on it. She went to her room. She took her own ledger, the private one, 9 years of meticulous personal accounting, and she extracted the relevant figures from memory, writing them out in a clear, organized hand on fresh paper, the original entry, the date of misallocation, the propagation across the 5 subsequent entries, the corrected figures, the actual quarterly performance of the Eastern Farm against the estate average, and a single annotated note indicating the source documents that would confirm each figure. She organized this in 3 pages. At the top of the first page she wrote the date and the words, "For the council's consideration," and at the bottom she wrote her name. She returned to the corridor in 18 minutes, and gave the pages to Prentice. He read them standing. He looked up once, with the expression of a man who has just watched a calculation he trusted confirmed against original source material. Then he turned and went downstairs. She returned to the schoolroom, checked Thomas's progress, corrected Clara's Latin exercise, and waited. She had managed things that were not hers to manage for 9 years. She could manage this. 50 minutes later, she heard Everard's voice in the corridor, not raised, but moving with a decision. and then the sound of the east drawing room door. An hour after that, Prentice appeared again at the schoolroom door. "The northern contracts will be renewed on the existing terms," he said. "The eastern farm will remain tenant-farmed. Sir Crane has withdrawn his projections." A pause. He was not pleased. Cecilia kept her eyes on Clara's work. "I imagine not." "His Grace wishes to see you," Prentice said, "in the library, when you have a moment." She completed the correction she was making. It was important to complete corrections, and told Thomas they would resume after lunch, and went downstairs. The library was quiet. Everard was standing beside the central table, looking at her 3 pages of documentation. He was still in his council clothes, formal, contained, the coat precisely buttoned, but his expression, when he looked up as she entered, was not formal at all. It was the expression of a man who has been looking at something carefully and has arrived at a conclusion he is still in the process of accepting. "This is your hand," he said. "Yes," she said. "From memory," he said. It was not quite a question. "I retain figures," she said. "I find them easier to keep than names." He was quiet for a moment. Sir Crane brought 14 months of incorrect projections to this council. If the correction had not been made today, the northern contracts would have been renegotiated, and the eastern farm let within the quarter. "I know," she said. "You knew before today." "I knew before today," she said. "I did not know it would become consequential today. Why did you not tell me sooner?" She met his gaze with the direct steadiness she brought to every difficult question. "Because you did not ask me, and because I am the governess." He looked at her, the particular measuring look she had first seen in the schoolroom door, the one she had not yet fully catalogued, and she held it without difficulty, because she had been holding the direct attention of people who underestimated her for 9 years, and she had learned, a long time ago, that steadiness was not aggression. "You are," he said finally, "considerably more than the governess." She did not respond to this, not because it undid her. It did not quite undo her, or rather it almost did, and she chose not to let it, but because the correct response was not immediately available. She picked up the 3 pages from the table, aligned them precisely, and set them back down. "The schoolroom window," she said, "the northern-facing one. It should be resealed before October." He looked at her for another moment, and then said, with something at the edge of his voice that was not quite the warmth of a man who laughed easily, but was the warmth of one who understood the value of a precisely placed word, "I will send the carpenter this week." "Thank you," she said. She walked back up the stairs. She sat at the schoolroom table after the children were settled for their rest hour, and did not open her ledger. She pressed one hand flat on the table surface, just a moment, and breathed. He had said she was considerably more than the governess. She had been doing real skilled work in invisible positions for 9 years, and he had said it plainly, without ornamentation, as a plain conclusion from evidence. She was not certain what to do with that. She was not certain she had been offered something that would hold. She had learned not to count on things that merely looked like recognition. She opened her ledger and wrote the day's date and continued. The Midsummer Assembly at the neighboring estate of Alderton House was organized by Lady Cecilia Alderton, no relation, with the specific ambition of establishing her drawing room as the social center of the county. 200 people were invited. The Duke of Kestmore was expected. Lady Helena had prepared for this occasion with considerable attention. She wore pale blue silk that was exactly correct for the setting and for her coloring, and she descended the main staircase of Kestmore Park at 8 in the evening, with the specific assurance of a woman who had confirmed her position in the household and expected the wider world to confirm it also. Cecilia watched from the upper landing, not from any particular intention to watch, but because she had been crossing to the schoolroom to retrieve a book she had forgotten, and the timing was what it was. She was in her plain working dress. She was holding the book she had just remembered she needed to go back for. She was not attending. Governesses were not invited to the Alderton Assembly. This was correct, and she had not expected otherwise. Everard appeared from the east corridor in his full formal dress, black tailcoat, precisely knotted cravat, the composed authority of a man who wore social obligation without performing it. He looked up as he crossed the entrance hall, and he saw her on the upper landing. She was not certain what her face was doing. She was not particularly practiced at controlling her face when no one was supposed to be looking. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Lady Helena, who was waiting by the front door with her prepared smile. Then he looked back up. He said nothing. He extended his arm to Lady Helena and they went out. The house was quiet after that. Cecilia went to the eastern sitting room because she had been going there in the evenings, and the habit had formed without her exactly organizing it. She sat at the pianoforte and played his mother's composition from the beginning, all the way through. For the first time, she had been learning it in pieces, building it from its component sections, and it held together. It was a clear, careful piece, not ornate, not demonstrative. The kind of composition that a person wrote for themselves, rather than for performance. She played it again. Then she sat for a while with her hands in her lap. The person being overlooked in any room is often the person keeping the room standing. She knew this. She had known it for 9 years. She returned her hands to the keys and played the third section again, because it required slightly more precision than the first two, and precision was always worth the additional attention. She was still at the pianoforte when she heard the carriage return. It was 11, which was earlier than she had expected. She stopped playing. She heard footsteps in the corridor, one set, direct, without the accompanying soft tread of Lady Helena's slippers, and then a knock at the eastern sitting room door. She stood before she said, "Come in." He came in. He was still in his formal coat, but his cravat had moved again. It always moved when he was working or thinking through something, and his expression was the particular contained expression of a man who has made a decision somewhere between the carriage and the door. "You were playing," he said. "I heard the carriage," she said. "I stopped." "Don't," he said. He said it with the same quality as his earlier no, a decision rather than a response. He crossed to the other side of the room and sat in the chair beside the window, as though he had been doing so for years, as though the room had a version of itself where this was ordinary. "Why did you return early?" she said. A pause. "I found I preferred to be elsewhere." She looked at him. He looked back. It was not the measuring look. It was something quieter, older than that, less organized. "Play it through," he said, "from the beginning." She sat down and played it from the beginning. He sat in the chair beside the window with his hands still and his face still, and he listened to his mother's composition played by a woman who had learned it from a handwritten folio and had given it back to the room where it belonged, and Cecilia played carefully, because careful was what the piece required, and when she finished, there was a moment of complete quiet. "She would have liked you," he said. He said it with the particular difficulty of a man saying something true that he has not rehearsed. Cecilia pressed one hand briefly against the key cover, not a sound, just a contact. "I think I would have liked her." He did not say anything for a time. Then he said, "I have handled this badly." She waited. "There has been an expectation," he said, "in the household, that I have allowed to accumulate, because—" He stopped, started again. "Because I did not think clearly about the cost of allowing it." He meant Lady Helena. She understood him without further specification. "I will speak to Lady Helena tomorrow," he said, "clearly and fairly. She deserves clarity." Cecilia said, "She is a capable woman. She will manage." "Yes," he said, "I believe she will." Another pause. "I am not certain I have the right to ask what I am considering asking. Your position here is already— I am your employer. The distance between us is not a small thing." "No," she said, "it is not a small thing." He stood from the chair and crossed to the pianoforte, not standing over her but beside her, alongside, in the way of someone who has decided that the correct position is not the comfortable one. He looked at the music folio. 9 years, he said. It was not a complete sentence. He had not made it one. He had heard, somewhere in the course of the past weeks, enough about her history, from Prentice, from context, from the particular way she organized things, to understand the 9 years without her having described them. 9 years, she agreed. "I would like to ask you," he said, and stopped. She waited with the composure of a woman who had been managing incomplete situations for 9 years, and was not going to let composure desert her now. when it was most required. "Not now," he said. "Not tonight. I need to speak to Lady Helena first, and I need to speak to my solicitor, and I need to—" He paused, with the precision of a man being honest with himself. "I need to make certain I am asking for the right reasons, and not simply because you played my mother's composition and corrected my accounts and told me my cravat was crooked." She looked at him for a moment, then she said, "For what it is worth, those are not the worst reasons I have heard of." He looked at her with something in his face that was not quite what she had expected, something between the weight of the decision and the very specific recognition that she had just, with complete composure, made him nearly smile. "Good night, Miss Marsh," he said. "Good night, Your Grace," she said. The summer quarter ended. Burkett returned from Nottingham. The corrected accounts were formally documented and witnessed, and the 3 pages in Cecilia's hand were added to the estate records, with a note from Prentice that referred to them, in the careful language of a solicitor who understood the weight of words, as the analytical framework that prevented a significant contractual misdirection. Sir Crane requested a second meeting. Everard declined it by letter. Lady Helena departed Kestmore Park on a Tuesday, with her 3 trunks and her maid, and the particular composed dignity of a woman who had received clarity and had chosen to meet it with self-possession. She and Cecilia did not have a direct exchange at her departure, but as Lady Helena passed through the entrance hall, she paused at the bottom of the staircase and looked up at the upper landing, not at anything in particular, simply at the space, with an expression that was not anger and not resignation, but something older and more considered. She went out. The house was, afterward, different in a way that was not absence but correction. Mrs. Lowry brought tea to the schoolroom that afternoon without being asked. The formal inquiry came in September. It was not, precisely, an inquiry. It was organized as a meeting of the Regional Estate Association. 12 landowners and their advisors gathered at Alderton House to review the summer's commercial outcomes and the state of the northern wool contracts. Everard had been invited as a matter of course. He had, against the expectations of everyone who knew him, invited Cecilia. Not as a guest, as a professional advisor. He had written to Prentice to arrange the form of it correctly, and Prentice had written back with language that managed to convey approval, satisfaction, and 60 years of accumulated professional judgment in 3 measured sentences. She sat at the far end of the table from the head, in the position appropriate to an advisor rather than a principal, with a leather folder containing the corrected accounts, the annotated contract terms from the Northern Wool agreements, and 2 pages of her own analysis. She had worked on those 2 pages for 5 evenings. They were, in her private assessment, the clearest work she had done. 12 men and their advisors filled the room. 2 of them noticed her immediately, with expressions that were the expressions of men encountering something unexpected in a space they had previously organized in their minds. The rest did not notice her at all, which was the usual distribution. Sir Crane was present. He was seated near the head of the table. He looked at Cecilia once, at the beginning, with the expression of a man recognizing an obstacle, and then looked away. The northern contracts were the 3rd item of business. When they were raised, the previous discussion had already consumed 40 minutes and established a general expectation that the terms would be renegotiated downward. Not because the evidence supported it, but because Sir Crane's confidence in the room created an atmosphere in which his conclusion seemed like a foregone consensus. Everard said, quietly, "Mr. Prentice has prepared documentation." He looked at Prentice, who looked at Cecilia. She opened her folder. She stood. She did not ask permission. She simply stood, because a standing person with organized documents commands the attention a seated person cannot, and attention was what the room required. The northern contracts, as currently structured, yield a margin of £412 annually to the Kestmore estate, she said. This figure has been consistent across 3 years and is documented in the quarterly ledgers, the copies of which are in the folder before each of you. She waited a moment while the room processed the word each, and the recognition that each of them had a copy arrived at different rates around the table. The proposal to renegotiate the contracts on the basis of the Eastern Farm figures as presented in June requires a correction. Those figures contained a misallocation error, documented and corrected in March. The corrected figures show the Eastern Farm operating at a 4% positive margin across the same 3-year period, not the deficit Sir Crane's projections describe. She did not look at Sir Crane. She looked at the room. The annotated contract terms on page 2 of your copies outline the adjustment to the northern contracts that the Kestmore estate would consider equitable, she continued. An increase of 9% over the current rate, reflecting the corrected production figures. This is not a negotiating position. It is a conclusion from the documented evidence. The room was quiet. Not the quiet of a room convinced. The quiet of a room that has encountered precision from an unexpected source and has not yet decided how to respond to it. Sir Crane said, with the specific smoothness of a man who understood that his authority was being challenged and was choosing not to appear to recognize it. "Miss, I'm sorry. I don't believe we have been introduced. Miss Cecilia Marsh," she said. "I am the analytical advisor to the Duke of Kestmore in this matter." "I see," Sir Crane said. He looked at the folder in front of him without opening it. "And your qualification for this analysis is—" "The accounts," she said. She said it simply, without heat. "The qualification is the accounts. They are in the folder." She sat down. The room did not erupt, not immediately. There was a suspended moment in which 12 men and their advisors looked at the folders in front of them, and several opened theirs, and 1 or 2 turned to the page she had indicated, and the figure £412 sat on the page with the particular authority of a number that has been arrived at correctly. Everard had been watching the room throughout. He had not intervened. He had not needed to. He turned now to Sir Crane and said, with the composed authority of a man who had made his decision before he entered the room, "I would ask that the folder be reviewed before any further discussion. The documentation is complete." Sir Crane looked at him. Something moved across his expression, not capitulation but recalibration, the particular adjustment of a man who has encountered evidence he cannot efficiently dismiss and knows it. The contracts were reviewed. The discussion continued for another hour. At the end of it, the renegotiation that Sir Crane had proposed was withdrawn. The 9% increase that Cecilia had outlined was not approved. 7% was agreed, with a review in 12 months, but it was approved. Prentice, gathering his papers at the close of the meeting, leaned toward her and said, so quietly it was almost to himself, 7% is a great deal better than a deficit. "Yes," she said, "it is." She was organizing her folder when she heard Everard's voice, not directed at her, but at the room in the particular way of a man choosing to direct something at a room rather than at a person. "I would like to formally acknowledge," he said, in the clear carrying voice he used for the things that required to be heard, "that the analytical preparation for this meeting was conducted by Miss Cecilia Marsh. The accuracy of the documentation, and the conclusions she drew from it, are what changed the shape of this morning's discussion." The room was quiet again, with the particular quality of a quiet that contains recalibration. He was not finished. He looked at Cecilia directly, across the length of the table, with 12 people as witnesses, and the full social weight of the room resting on the decision he was making in public. "Miss Marsh," he said, "will you allow me to walk with you?" It was not technically a declaration. It was, in the precise mechanics of what it communicated to 12 men who understood exactly how a duke moved through rooms and how he spoke to people within them, the clearest possible statement of what she was to him and what he intended. She closed her folder. She considered it, fully, the way she considered everything, and then she looked at him and said, "Yes." He crossed to her side of the table, and she gathered her papers, and they walked out together. Behind them, she heard Mr. Aldous Prentice say something quiet to the man beside him. She did not catch the words. She caught the tone, which was the tone of a man who has been right about something for a long time and is not going to say so loudly, but is not going to deny it either. Sir Crane did not speak. His silence was not agreement, and she did not require it to be. In the private study that Alderton House kept for the use of its guests, away from the remaining discussion, Everard closed the door and turned to face her. She stood with her folder under her arm, and her spine straight, and her expression the particular composed expression she wore when she was giving a situation her full attention and not allocating any of herself to performance. "The 7%, he said. "You knew it would not be 9. "I thought it might be 8, she said. "7 is reasonable." He looked at her. "Are you always this precise about reasonable?" "Yes," she said. He crossed the room. He did not stop in the middle distance. He came close, within the space of someone who has decided that the appropriate distance is the honest one, and looked at her with the expression she had catalogued through 6 weeks of library visits and corridor evenings and music in the closed room. The expression that was not the calculating attention of the first evening, but something heavier and quieter than that. Something that had been building with the patience of a man who does not rush conclusions. "I said in June that you were considerably more than the governess," he said. "You did," she said. "I have been, since June, working up to saying considerably more than that." A pause. He said it with the specific self-awareness of a man who does not naturally offer this kind of accounting, and is choosing to do so. "I have not managed it quickly." "No," she said. "You have not." "I am going to ask you now," he said. "Not because it is convenient or appropriate, or fitted the requirements my position imposes, not because you saved the Eastern Farm account, or corrected Sir Crane's projections, or gave me my mother's composition back." He stopped. He said it plainly, without ornament, in the direct way of a man who has arrived at precision through great care. "Because you are the most completely yourself of anyone I have encountered, and I find that I have arranged the entire machinery of my days so that they contain you, and I would like to ask you to stay, not as the governess, as mine." She stood with his words settling in her, the way a well-built structure settles, not with drama, not with noise, but with the quiet confirmation of something made to hold weight. She thought about it, completely, the way she thought about everything. The wool merchant's office in 1838, the 14 months of debt and the creditor's grudging 11, the ledger, the placement after that, Thomas's Latin and Clara's ambition, and the Eastern sitting room pianoforte, and the music she had not expected to find, and had not expected to feel anything about. His hand against the doorframe. The cravat, crooked 40 minutes and then corrected, both directions. "Yes," she said. Not immediately, and not dramatically, simply, directly, and completely. He reached forward and took her hand, her bare hand, because she had removed her gloves to handle the documents, and held it with the specific, careful deliberateness of a man who understands that this is the first time and wants it to be done right. He lifted it and pressed his lips to her fingers. She did not cry, her spine did not relax. She looked at him with the stillness that was not absence of feeling but the organization of it, and she thought, "I have been waiting to be seen for 9 years." She had brought everything she had, and she had put it to work. They were married in October, in the small church on the Kestmore estate grounds, with Prentice as witness, and Mrs. Lowry managing the flowers and the arrangement of the house with the particular efficiency of a woman who has been waiting for events to catch up to her organizational capabilities. Thomas carried the rings with the serious frown of a boy conscious of responsibility. Clara had opinions about the order of the ceremony that she communicated privately and in detail, and which were not incorporated, and which she accepted with a dignified irritation that Cecilia thought augured very well for her future, in whatever she decided to do with herself. Prentice told Cecilia, privately, before the ceremony, that Sir Crane had sent a letter acknowledging the corrected contract terms, and noting, in language so careful as to be almost meaningless, that the analysis presented at the September meeting had been organized with notable thoroughness. Prentice had replied with an equally careful letter. He showed her the reply, because he understood she would appreciate it. She did. Lady Helena Vane wrote a letter in November, to Everard, formally, congratulating the marriage. It was a well-composed letter, correct in every detail. Cecilia read it at his request, and told him it was a letter from a person who had managed something difficult, and was choosing to do it with self-possession. He folded it and put it in the estate correspondence file, which was the appropriate place for it. Cecilia continued her analysis of the estate accounts through the winter months, now not in the margins of her evening hours but by arrangement, with Burkett's cooperation, across a proper working desk in the estate office, that had been cleared for the purpose. She was not officially named to any position. That was not the point. The work was the point, and the work was real, and it was credited now, and that was what made the difference. In March of 1848, she wrote a 12-page reform proposal for the estate's tenant farm management, organized around the evidence of 7 years of Kestmore accounts, and supported by documentation from 2 neighboring estates that Prentice had quietly facilitated access to. The proposal recommended 3 structural changes to how rents were calculated and tenant improvements were credited. Everard read it in an evening and brought it to Burkett the following morning. By June, the first of the 3 changes was in operation. By the end of that year, it had recovered £43 in margin across the eastern and northern farms combined. The following year, the second change was implemented. The neighboring estate of Hargrove requested a copy of the proposal. Cecilia sent it, annotated in her hand with notes specific to their tenancy structure, because a general framework without local application was less useful than a specific one, and she saw no reason to send them something less useful than she could make it. Their daughter was born in April of 1849, in the same room where the Kestmore duchesses had been confined for 3 generations, as Mrs. Lowry noted with a satisfaction so thorough it was nearly ceremonial. They named her Eleanor, for his mother. She was a serious child with a direct gaze, and an early interest in patterns that Cecilia recognized, without saying so, as a familiar quality. Thomas went to school in the autumn of 1849, with Latin fluency that his new schoolmaster described, in a letter to Kestmore Park, as unusual and technically precise. Cecilia read this letter at the breakfast table, and was satisfied with it in a way she did not make large. He mentioned unusual, Everard said, looking at the letter. He also mentioned technically precise, she said. That is the better compliment. You would think so, he said. Yes, she said, I would. He was watching her in the way he had developed over the course of a year of marriage, not the measuring attention of that first doorway moment, but something that had become settled in him, part of the ordinary operation of how he moved through his days. It was the watching of a man who had organized his existence around another person's presence, and found the organization, to his considered satisfaction, exactly right. She knew he was watching. She had known for some time that she was aware of his watching in the specific, ordinary, comfortable way of knowing something that no longer required analysis. It simply was. The way the corrected accounts were, the way Eleanor's particular frown was, the way the Eastern sitting room pianoforte now sounded in the evenings when Clara occasionally played it, badly and with great enthusiasm, and the sound traveled through the corridor and down the staircase, and into the study where Cecilia sat at her desk with her ledger. The ledger was the same kind she had kept since 1838. She had begun a new one with the year of her marriage, and the entries were different now. Not the carefully calculated survival mathematics of a woman working against debt and invisibility, but the records of a household in genuine operation, of a professional legacy being built in the margins of everything else, of a life that was correctly proportioned to what she had brought to it. In the evening, Everard came to find her. Eleanor had escaped her nurse and was making her way down the corridor in the particular determined manner of a child not yet 2 years old, who has a destination in mind and does not believe in obstacles, and he scooped her up in one arm as he passed, with the particular ease of a man who has discovered that children are not, as he had perhaps assumed, entirely beyond his management. Eleanor grabbed his cravat. It moved significantly to the left. Cecilia looked up from her desk, across the room, at the 2 of them in the doorway, the contained, precise man with the entirely disordered cravat and the serious-faced child attached to the source of disorder, and she set down her pen. 40 seconds, she said. This time I am counting from the beginning. He looked at her with the expression she had first catalogued in June of 1847 outside a schoolroom door, and had been reading correctly ever since. The expression of a man who has found, in the most unlikely of rooms, the person who keeps everything standing, and who intends, for all the years remaining to them, to make certain she knows that she is seen. Come and fix it then, he said. She rose from the desk, crossed the room, and did.